Jamie wants to know the concept of chemical dependence. Oh, she's curious about the concept of chemical dependence and LPP's take on that. Why do heroin and alcohol users sometimes need medication-assisted treatments, medication-assisted therapies to safely detox? And she wrote, I think. And it seems LPP doesn't believe in chemical dependency. Maybe I have that wrong, though. Please discuss.
Well, there's a term that never comes from my lips, which is physical dependence. Like there's physical dependence and there's psychological dependence. They're two totally different things. And first of all, DSM-5 and American Pharmacology have thrown that out the window. And I wrote a book called The Meaning of Addiction, where I pointed out when they originally created concept of physical dependence, they said there were only two things that fell in that category: narcotics, opioids, and alcohol. But they changed that. And they changed it because, well, physical dependence doesn't have a well-defined meaning. When people get used to being intoxicated with marijuana, is that physical dependence or is that psychological dependence? I tell the story, I'm writing my memoir, and I went to the animal laboratories at the University of Michigan. Somehow I got myself admitted there when I was 22 years old with Archie. And we went in, James Wood, the lab was run by a man who went on to become the head of the NIDA, Charles Schuster, who was a big booster of mine. He's dead. James Woods ran the laboratory. And he said, well, what are you doing here? And I said, well, I have some different ideas about addiction. And I began to talk a little bit. And they said, well, marijuana isn't addictive because it doesn't cause withdrawal and tolerance. And I said, I know people who've learned to drive when they were intoxicated on marijuana and they couldn't originally. Is that like tolerance? And he said, well, you could call that tolerance. And I said, when people break up in a relationship, in love relationships, some people can't sleep for nights at a time. Some people kill themselves. Couldn't that be called withdrawal? And he said, well, you could call that withdrawal. And he smiled because those guys, experimental guys, are more open-minded than disease guys. And so the ironclad concepts that define physical dependence aren't ironclad. They can't be separated from psychological. You can't say, well, why does a person lose all bearing when they break up in a love relationship? Why do they kill the person that they said they loved? Why do they commit suicide? That's an awful strong reaction. It's almost physical. Is that physical dependence? It's a dichotomy. Somebody accused us of seeing a dichotomy between physical and psychological when we're talking about applying LPP. We're doing the reverse. We're saying you can't separate any element of addiction, one from the other. What can be called physical and what can be called psychological there's no such distinction, can't be differentiated. Do you have any reaction to that, Zach?
I think you pretty much summed it up. It's where does one end, where does the other begin? If you really, that becomes a complicated question upon really minimal inspection.
And no human being can perform that analysis. And that's what Buddhism and a million other mind thought things are about. They say, well, if you think things through, you have a totally different reaction to them throughout your body and the universe.